Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to this session of PMAC 2021. The objective of this session is to discuss effective measures to better address health preparedness and the development, supply, and equitable distribution of health products needed to address COVID-19 and also future public health emergencies. And this builds on some of the conversations we had yesterday in an earlier webinar on COVID-19 in the context of trade agreements. Now, to start off today, Professor Brooke Baker will provide the context of intellectual property rights and what governments might need to do to address their burdens of exclusivity. Following on, Dr. Modi Paulichini will describe the role of the medicine patent pool in alleviating some of those burdens. Dr. Yuan Chi-Ong Hu with MSF will return us to the discussion on the issue of patents, TRIPS flexibilities, and the new call for a TRIPS waiver on all COVID-related health products. She'll be followed by Greg Perry, who will bring the perspectives of the pharmaceutical industry on the long contentious issue of patents and access to medicines. And finally, Dr. Suresh Jadhav will speak to these issues from his vantage of directing the Serum Institute of India, reflecting concerns of medicine manufacturers in developing countries. So it is a stellar panel on a very important issue as we come to terms with COVID-19 and try to prepare ourselves both for the present and into the future. So thank you all for joining, and I would like now to turn the session over to Professor Baker.
Thank you very much. Let me get my PowerPoint up. Okay, so first of all, I'd certainly like to thank the organizers of the conference and this webinar and my fellow panelists, and of course, all of those around the world who are tuning into this important topic. My job is to help frame the contribution of the other panelists, who will focus primarily on initiatives and proposals to overcome barriers to equitable access to existing and promising COVID-19 health technologies. I'm going to do that by contrasting the world's business as usual approach to preserving intellectual property in the midst of this viral firestorm with an alternative approach that would cast off the burdens of exclusivity. My presentation is to compare and contrast, focusing on an existing innovation and access ecology that is privatized, where the benefits of scientific progress are enclosed in a web of exclusivities, patent, trade secret, industrial design, and software monopolies covering biochemical substances, biologic resources, diagnostic tools, and research platforms. And combined with that, unfettered commercial control over the manufacturing, price, and distribution of health technologies. I will contrast this IP and market fundamentalism with an alternative vision that opens the scientific commons, that prioritizes transparency and collaboration, that identifies the most promising candidates, that guarantees safety and efficacy, that expands supply and reduces prices, and ensures that equitable distribution of life-saving vaccines, medicines, diagnostics, and other medical supplies to all in need, no matter where they live. So the first issue to, I think, focus on is the basic issue of scientific preparedness. Where were we? Were we prepared for this pandemic? And how much of our degree of preparedness or unpreparedness was due to the incentive systems that we currently rely on? So the world was caught flat-footed in terms of pandemic preparedness, despite earlier brushes with SARS and MERS in the past 2 decades. Blips in funding basic science research on coronaviruses, both public and private, were short-lived and overwhelmed by the biopharmaceutical industry's relentless focus on vaccines and medicines with better commercial prospects. Blockbusters, niche busters, specialty drugs and biologics, and medicines for orphan diseases with high price potential. The solution to this business as usual focus on medical products primarily based on immediate commercial potential is to really have a strategy of focusing on pandemic preparedness against the thousands of threatening pathogens that must be taken much more seriously by funders of basic science research, universities, and by industry itself. Funding must be sufficient and sustained, and researchers must receive incentives to focus on infectious disease pathogens, their biological pathways, and the biomedical response platforms that are needed. Secondly, we need to think about the contrast between closed science, silos and secrecy, and collaborative and open science. There was an initial phase of collaboration between scientists in sharing SARS-CoV-2 genome and other early scientific knowledge, but that became compartmentalized once knowledge showed commercial potential. Instead of open science with free sharing of knowledge, findings, and data, and coordination and collaboration between scientists and product developers to optimize innovation and discovery, the world experienced a return to siloed, secretive research, premature touting of preliminary findings, in a Wild West race for first discovery, and an enclosure of knowledge with patents, data exclusivities, trade secret, and informational dark holes. The alternative is open science research and collaboration, including the pooling and open source publication of research finding and data. There should be much greater funding of biopharmaceutical R&D by governments, with a much greater focus on neglected and emerging diseases. Government funding should come with strings attached with respect to minimizing exclusive rights, prioritizing open licensing and technology transfer, and requiring a commitment to equitable access. Clinical trials, the critical stage of trying to figure out which products are safe and efficacious. So I would contrast the clinical trial chaos with the alternative of clinical trial coordination and comparative studies. The demise of open science was followed by a helter-skelter of underpowered and uncoordinated clinical trials designed to burnish scientific reputations and to secure commercial advantage rather than to develop robust, reproducible evidence of clinical safety and efficacy, and to compare candidate products and combination products against each other to discover best detection, prophylactic, and treatment outcomes. Although there have been some efforts at better planning and coordination of trials, including the WHO Solidarity trial, and proposals for data sharing, by and large, there has been a huge waste of research potential that confounds the efforts to identify and prioritize the best pharmaceutical and diagnostic interventions, while still maintaining incentives for product adaptation and further improvements. Paradoxically, some of the populations most at risk of COVID-19 have been disproportionately underrepresented in clinical trials. What's the solution? What's the alternative? Clinical trials should be better planned, both to detect comparative safety and efficacy and to weigh plausible combination regimens, and should also be designed to be inclusive of participation by historically excluded and underrepresented groups, including women, pregnant people, people with disabilities, racial minorities, and most certainly people from low and middle income countries. What's happened with respect to regulatory approval, decision by governments to allow marketing of medicines? So I would contrast the reckless product authorizations and commercial priorities that are guiding market entry decisions at this point versus assurance of product safety, efficacy, and built-in quality and a guarantee of universal, not sporadic regulatory approval. Commercial motivations have always prompted companies to lobby for over-accelerated regulatory pathways, particularly emergency use authorizations and listings in the COVID-19 response. And some of those have been also supported by the political pressure from government leaders intent on being proactive. But unfortunately, cronyism has resulted in some instances in approvals, including in the country I come from, and not science. Even after registration or emergency use authorization is achieved in rich countries or through WHO pre-qualification, companies still maintain exclusive control over decisions of where and when to register their products, meaning that many poor and smaller countries are often left out of the loop and receive the medicines only much after they've been introduced in rich countries. The solution is to have appropriate, accelerated and harmonized regulatory pathways, but there still always needs to be a baseline to assess scientifically the benefits of the medical product against the known and anticipated risks. The guidance for emergency use needs to be strengthened for riskier interventions used by large populations such as vaccines. There need to be rigorous post-marketing surveillance requirements and further requirements to seek formal regulatory approval or WHO pre-qualification. Efforts to increase reliance, recognition, and reference on trustworthy regulatory decisions elsewhere needs to be intensified. Finally, there must be a new mandate, one that's frankly not been discussed widely in the access to medicines movement, which is a requirement of prompt and universal marketing approval. We have to have an imperative for companies to finally register everywhere. Price and supply. So I would contrast the exclusive rights and the high prices and limited supply that results from those exclusive rights with open licensing, full technology transfer, low prices, and expanded supply. Patent thickets, data exclusivity, and trade secret protections enclose the COVID innovation commons and lead to higher prices and false scarcity. Both major transnational biopharmaceutical companies and startups have raced to patent offices and locked up crucial know-how and biological resources in trade secret vaults. Having gained control over the geese that lay the golden eggs, IP right holders thereafter enter into lucrative ownership, acquisition, manufacturing, and distribution agreements, all of which maintain tight control over manufacturing and artificially limit supply to what is needed to meet the needs of the entire global community. Race to the finish line by bigger players has left many promising products short on capital and without paths to commercialization, meaning that the COVID response will be weaker than it should be. The companies with the biggest purse entered into agreements with other companies and contract manufacturers, which will reduce manufacturing capacity options for competitive products or for true generic competition. Armed with their exclusive rights, big pharma companies and major diagnostic companies can also set their own price, and I've already done so based not on costs of manufacture, but on what the market could bear. Thus, we have remdesivir, a medicine that may not even have therapeutic benefit, priced as much as $3,120 for 6 doses, even though the true cost of production may lie between $5 and $50. Similarly, Moderna has set a price for its vaccine candidate as much as $74 for a 2-shot course of treatment. Instead of these privately owned exclusive rights, there should be open licensing and voluntary or mandatory deep technology transfer for all new approved COVID medical technologies to allow and incentivize supply by diverse manufacturers globally, and to allow for production at efficient economies of scale and then sale at affordable prices. To the maximum extent possible, these medical products need to be free at the point of use, most certainly for poor people and people living in low and middle income countries. Distribution. What's the distinction between commercial control over distribution and fair and equitable distribution? So biopharmaceutical and diagnostic companies typically sell their products at higher prices to rich countries, leaving them with less profit incentive to sell to low and middle income countries. Not only does this current economic regime leave price and supply volumes to the hands of private profit maximizing companies, it gives them near total control over which customers to prioritize. Particularly in periods of scarcity, this can lead to bidding wars, which certainly occurred with respect to global supplies of personal protective equipment. The solution is governments under the direction of a global framework need to take control over the distribution of essential global public goods like COVID-19 health products. The market alone could not be allowed to organize distribution on a profit maximizing basis. But then we also have simultaneously the problem of what we now call vaccine, therapeutic, and diagnostic nationalism, nationalistic hoarding versus the imperative of equitable access. When fully in control of pricing and supply decisions because of their exclusive rights, the biopharmaceutical industry has artificially limited manufacturing capacity, which has in turn prompted a nationalistic gold rush to secure preferential access to COVID-19 health products by the US, UK, Europe, Japan, Canada, Russia, China, India, Brazil, and others. The US has placed the biggest bets, spending over $13 billion through various programs to try to speed development, but also to secure preferential supplies. The mad scramble for vaccines in particular has resulted in, by recent estimates from Duke, 8.8 billion doses being reserved primarily for rich countries, US, Canada, UK, EU, and Japan. The result is, according to Duke, that most LMICs will not receive vaccines until 2024. Hoarding can take another form when countries impose export controls, like 80 countries did before that Ron and others discussed yesterday. But with the new wave we're experiencing, it could happen again. The solution is we need truly global mechanisms to ensure that COVID-19 health products are equitably distributed according to ethical allocation principles to every country in the world and within each country. It is simply indefensible that America first, or UK first, or Europe first would result in everyone else being last. Rational pool procurement mechanisms need to be established whereafter truly equitable distribution for all global populations must occur. Priorities may and should be established for early supplies according to disease vulnerability and essential job functions. But COVID-19 health products are truly global public goods, essential to the realization of the right to health and to the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And they must therefore be equitably accessed. If they are not, according to the study at my university, if vaccines are not equitably distributed, twice as many people will die globally. So my panelists are going to talk about a number of promising initiatives and proposals. So the more radical proposals include a waiver proposal from South Africa and India to the WTO that intellectual property rights covering COVID health technologies be suspended or waived during the period of the pandemic. There's a companion request from least developed countries that their TRIPS extension period be extended for so long as they remain LDCs and then thereafter for another 12 years. There is an addition of proposal. There are proposals that countries are free to use Article 73 of the TRIPS agreement, the so-called national security waiver provision, to implement a rule against recognizing COVID-19 intellectual property rights during the pandemic. There are expanded and possibly coordinated campaigns for use of compulsory licenses when other voluntary methods are unsuccessful. And we heard yesterday during Ron's panel some of the efforts at operationalizing new intellectual property rules to allow compulsory licensing that have been undertaken by several countries, including rich countries. And then there's a very promising people's vaccine campaign that seeks to override exclusivities, expand technology transfer, and ensure free access at the point of care. There are also more moderate proposals. There's the establishment of the COVID-19 technology access pool and also the existing medicine patent pool, which could openly license promising COVID technologies. There's the Open COVID Pledge and a university-inspired Open COVID Pledge facility as well. There are bilateral voluntary licenses that have already been negotiated with some strengths and weaknesses. We know that there's the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator and the vaccine pillar, the establishment of the COVAX facility, And finally, there are regional solidarity efforts. So I've gone perhaps over long just to try to set the framework for our discussion, but I hope I've convinced people that we have two different models that we could approach. We could have business as usual, or we could take down the barriers to access that we currently face.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brooke, for your introductory comments, which really do set the stage very nicely for what's going to follow. I will admit that I'm a bit intrigued that you looked at these two different systems, and your PowerPoint sort of indicated that somehow they're in balance with each other. But we'll save your comment back on that for when we get to the questions. My apologies to the panelists and to the attendees. I forgot at the beginning to announce the fact that please use the question and answer function, and note your questions as you listen to the panelists. So we'll return to them after all the panelists have finished, and we'll try to select some of the questions to actually then invite you to open up your microphone and to be able to pose the question directly to the panelists. And some of you are interested about whether or not there's going to be a rerun session. And I indicated in the chat function that yes, you can go back and log on to PMAC 2021, whether the .org or the .com is the best way to sort of get access. But once you get access, you'll sort of see the list of all the webinars that have already been presented and the ones coming up, and the ones that have been presented you can go back and listen to very much. So thank you very much, Brooke. And now with the the nice lead-in that you gave to Marie-Paul, I will invite Marie-Paul to discuss about the medicine patent pool.
Thanks a lot. So it's a pleasure for me to participate in this panel discussion. Indeed, access to medicine is dear to my heart. The ones of you who know me may have known me as Assistant Director General at WHO since I left the WHO in 2017. Because I retired from WHO. I have had many other hats. I'm a director of research at INSERM, for example. I have a lot of dealings with COVID vaccines, but this is not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about my role and as the chair of the medicines patent pool, and convince you of the effort and the impact that organizations like the MPP, Medicines Patent Pool, can have on access to medicines in general, and in particular also access to medicines against COVID in low and middle income countries. So the vision, of course, for the MPP is a world where people have access, rapid access to effective and affordable treatments and other health technologies. And for this, what we want to do, our mission, is to increase access and facilitate the development of life-saving medicines for low and middle-income countries through voluntary licensing and patent pooling. So this is one of the approach, the less radical approach that was just described. So how does it work? Well, the MPP identifies first medicines which are needed in the low and middle-income country where licenses could improve access. So it's not for every drug, but it's mainly for the one which are the most needed and for which price is an issue. We have worked in particular in the field of HIV, and you will see in my next slide the impact that we have had. Now, when we have identified a medicine, then we negotiate a license with patent holders, so-called innovator companies, from a public health perspective. So our licenses favor all the terms that would maximize public benefit of having the access to the drugs. Then we accelerate the access to this drug through working with generic companies to whom we provide generic licenses, always with public health terms. And through these licenses, then the generic companies produce these drugs. We try to stimulate competition, because of what we've seen, it's only competition actually which has a real impact on decreasing prices. So this is an example here. These are a combination of dolutegravir, which is now used as a preferred first-line regimen, is in agreement with the World Health Organization in many countries. So you can see, thanks to the licenses that MPP has been able to negotiate, with the originator and then with a large number of generic manufacturers, we have now access the 80.3% of the population living with HIV in 81 countries has no access to these drugs at much lower price than what you can see in high-income countries. Now, what about COVID-19? So COVID-19, of course, was not on the radar screen of the MPB, like it wasn't on the radar screen of most organizations a year ago. And on March 30th, on the 2020, so the board of the Medicines Patent Pool agreed to temporarily extend the mandate for the MPP to include any health technology that would contribute to the global response to COVID-19 and where licensing could facilitate innovation and access. So we are doing this with the support of Unitaid, which is the funder the main funder of Medicines Patent Pool, and which allowed us to use the resources that they provide us to work on other diseases to provide access, to try to increase access for COVID patients to innovation and innovation in medicines in particular. So what is needed for COVID-19? And let me focus here on treatments more and not on vaccines. A few items are needed. First, we need to have access, and including for the poorest country, and this is that was very well described by the previous speaker. And what can MPP do for this? But MPP can leverage their diverse geographic footprints and different manufacturers and suppliers in order to be able to afford access, to increase access to poor countries everywhere in the world. What's also needed? Well, large volumes are needed to meet large demand, and it is likely that the originators don't have the capacity to produce by themselves enough drugs to supply the whole world. Through generic licensing, as we have been doing for HIV drugs, we can leverage the manufacturing capacity of multiple suppliers in low and middle income countries to increase the volumes which is available. We need unprecedented speed, but we know that manufacturers are ready already to develop generic new treatment if we have some which work, which is another issue, of course. What we need, we don't need any products, we need quality products, because who would want to take a treatment if it's a low quality, a dangerous treatment? So this is why we ensure that the MPP licensees supply quality assured drugs, and the drugs that we supply are pre-qualified by the World Health Organization. We need also affordable prices, and as I mentioned already, competition is key to keep prices low and to ensure affordability. So here we have a case study for COVID-19. It's a case about lopinavir ritonavir. So lopinavir ritonavir is a drug for HIV. So in March, because there were hopes that the repurposing of lopinavir ritonavir might help in the treatment of COVID, and there was a lot of enthusiasm to test this drug, which was originally from AbbVie, in order to try to save the lives of patients with COVID-19. And in March, the patent holder, AbbVie, informed the Medicines Patent Pool that it will no longer enforce its patent on lopinavir ritonavir and allow sale of generics worldwide. So, as I said, this is an HIV medicine, but it was seen as having promise for COVID-19. Unfortunately, the WHO Solidarity trial showed definitely that lopinavir ritonavir is not effective against COVID-19 for hospitalized patients, and the product has therefore been deprioritized for treatment of COVID. But this shows that it is possible, and we hope that other manufacturers, if they have patents on products which are shown to be useful to treat COVID patients, will likewise, like did AbbVie, make it available to the whole world. Just even though the lopinavir/ritonavir was not found to work for COVID, we know that it works very well for HIV, and the gesture of AbbVie has allowed now affordable access to standard second-line treatment made of lopinavir/ritonavir to all patients with HIV. So something good coming out of it. So MPP is also involved in the various international initiatives against COVID-19, which were described just previously. One of them is called ACT-A, which is Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which was launched in April 2020, and which generated pledges of up to $7 billion to help procure drugs, vaccine, diagnostics, and other devices for COVID-19 for low-income countries. So the ACT Accelerator, a global collaboration, wants to ensure access. It is organized into 4 pillars: vaccines, treatment, diagnostics, and what is called the health system connector. MPP is actively contributed to the pillar 2, which focuses on treatment. We have also a lot of discussion with the COVID Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, which was also introduced, launched in May 2020. CTAP will compile in one place pledges of commitment to voluntary licenses to share COVID-19 health technologies related knowledge, intellectual property, and data. CTAP will rely on existing mechanisms like the MPP for voluntary licensing, and we need currently to step up our collective efforts to engage constructively with industry to help this voluntary license to become a reality. So some observation and challenges to finish. I have seven points that I would like to bring. First, we need speed. And we are very proud at the MPP that we have been able to reduce through these voluntary licenses and working early with generic manufacturers at a time when the drugs were sometimes not yet available on the high-income country market. But we have been able to reduce this time to 3 to 4 years between innovator approval in high-income country and access in low and middle-income country. But 3 to 4 years is not sufficient for COVID. So we need to have an even quicker process to ensure access. Second point about repurposed medicine, there was a lot of hope, but it seems that unfortunately this is not working except for dexamethasone, which was found and described by the recovery trial in the UK as being very efficacious in severe COVID patients, but the others have not worked that much. And so we have to rely on new drugs that will be developed especially for targeting the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Third point is the importance of biologics. So we have not at MPP worked with biologics before, but it seems more and more that there is a promise in monoclonal antibodies. There is, of course, also this also comes with challenges, and there is in some countries limited experience in scaling up and supplying these biologics in low and middle income countries. But we need to work right now on strategies, and these include licensing and public health driven licenses for access to biologicals for COVID, but also beyond. Fourth point, collaboration is of paramount importance. There has been indeed unprecedented collaboration between pharmaceutical companies in the north, in the south, for the development and manufacturing of new COVID products. These need to be further leveraged to ensure access in low and middle income countries. Coming back on this collaboration, I would like to flag one, which sees the involvement of Serum Institute of India, for whom we have Suresh Jadhav. So this is the new collaboration which has been announced between IAVI, product development partnership in the US, Merck Darmstadt, an innovator company, and Serum Institute of India to develop and make accessible to low and middle income countries monoclonal antibodies which were developed at the Scripps Clinic. So congratulations to all those involved. Next point is about funding of an incentive. Public funding for R&D has so far not been leveraged sufficiently to ensure future access in low and middle income countries, and there has been limited political appetite to introduce incentives for broad licensing of COVID treatments, and this may limit the scope for licensing and its geographical reach. This should be improved, and all the money, the public funds which are being put for R&D should help increasing access, in particular in low and middle income countries. 6th point about access strategy. Access strategy are currently being explored through contract manufacturing, for example, which can cover immediate access gap, but this is mainly short term. We need to think medium term, and for more sustained access approaches, licensing, I'm convinced, will be important. And finally, procurement. Important efforts are made under the Act Accelerator to raise funds for the future procurement of medicine for low and middle income countries, but so far, still far less from enough has been raised, and efforts to raise more funds are urgently needed. So this is what I wanted to say today, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Paul. There's a kind of a hint of optimism in what could potentially be utilized with the medicine patent pool in terms of looking at COVID-19 interventions. This brings us now to return a little bit more to some of the issues of intellectual property rights. And so Dr. Yuan Jianghu, who is the Senior Legal Advisor with MSF, I'd like to invite her now to make her presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me share my screen. I also apologize. There is a construction work just started somewhere in my building, so there might be a remote sound, and I try to speak clearly and loudly in order not to interrupt the presentation. Thank you very much to have this opportunity presenting some of our observations on access to COVID-19 medical tools with you. So the title of my presentation is really looking at overcoming the barrier and how the future looks like. So MSF has been responding to COVID-19 in more than 60 countries out of the 72 countries we are working globally, including treatment and care for patients who are infected by COVID-19, and also very importantly to make sure the essential health services we are providing will have a limited and minimum interruption due to the pandemic. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we already see the challenges of ensuring uninterrupted access to existing medical tools. We had to make choices of rationing the provision of oxygen care for patients because of the shortage of supply. And in those experiences compared us to keep calling ensuring access for the existing and the future tools, which for us is a key to issue an effective global response. So I'm speaking in my capacity working with the Access Campaign, which was created in 1999 by MSF. So some of our funding members have started looking at the access issue from a more structural and systemic perspective. In addition to getting the specific product to patients who need, we see the ongoing injustice looming in the global system that continue to put patients as markets and put diseases that cannot provide a viable market in the neglected category. So whether this kind of observation still holds water is what I wanted to focus on in our discussion today. So building in this spirit, really our discussion about access to medicine from MSF is trying to remind why access to medicines and what is at stake, to what extent the profit should be kind of secondary when life should be priority and health should not be on sale. So I also wanted to remind many of our works have revealed how, using patent as one example, how industry has been using the current IP system to the maximum level of possibility in order to sustain and prolong the profit and the monopoly. All of these practices of evergreening, broadening patentability, extending patent terms, having more exclusivities, have put concrete barriers to ensure access to medicines for everybody who need it. So if we use that, keep that in mind, zooming into the access challenges in the pandemic now, we're really looking into the situation while as an IP continue enables privatization of public funded research and outcome, and could hindering the full leverage of global capacity of development, manufacturing and supply, and could pose immediate and future hindrance to ensure a universal access. So we see a large pipeline of medicines under development as well as vaccines. However, whether or not the current system will actually deliver is a question. So I will quickly go through some of the issues we see, and also and then before talking about the solution we think countries should support. As Marco has mentioned, there's a huge pipeline of therapeutics under development. From our perspective, there's a certain issues of concern. One is, even though there's no promising repurposed therapeutics showing sufficient efficacy, but there's still the pipeline in developing. Companies normally apply for patent on different formulations and second medical use, and the method of use of old medicines. All those evergreening practices could potentially emerge in the coming months. If governments are not taking action to curb those kind of practices, if a promising pipeline come into play, the patent situation would be very serious to tackle. One of the example is remdesivir, as we know. Although the drug does not really show efficacy based on WHO's recent solidarity trial concluding data, but the company's practice set up a very negative example how IP management has been done based on the business as usual approach. So Gilead, instead of looking at something different, entered into voluntary license agreement bilaterally with a few generic companies of its chosen, and then excluded nearly half of the world population from the licensed territory, including many of the high burden countries, and most of the Latin American countries were excluded. Many countries who have manufacturing capacities from the global south are also excluded. If we look at the situation of the pandemic, now many of the highly affected countries are in the high income context. None of them were included in the voluntary license of Gilead. And in fact, none of them have been included in any of the voluntary license in the past. So Mariko mentioned the biological pipeline. We also follow that. Many of the new candidates have already been under patents widely in many countries. And we published a briefing outlining the concern of access to therapeutics for your reference as well. So second category is a vaccine. So this is really a highlight of the discussion nowadays. And we also see consistent deny from industry lobbies and many actors that IP is an issue. They don't consider that there's an IP issue with vaccines. And we have a different opinion because looking at vaccines, we're basically looking at four problems with IP. One is the background technology. Many of the vaccine pipeline candidates nowadays are developed using existing technology is something that has been used in the past, developing different vaccine. So many of those platform technology are still under patent protection. And then for the future, when some of the inventions and technology develop from now on until the future years, there could be emerging landscape of patenting on COVID vaccine specifically. And we're also facing needing to access to manufacturing know-how and clinical data if we're talking about accelerating manufacture. And many of those information are under exclusive protection in some countries. And many of the bilateral technology transfer and licensing agreements, and most of them actually remain unknown to the public. So we don't actually know what we are looking at, in the future vaccine supply landscape. And our past experiences also show vaccine patenting behavior by company could concretely stop pipeline development. One example is the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, 13-valent version. And we're still following one dispute in India following this patent. And then the patent granted has effectively stopped a very promising developer in South Korea from developing this vaccine further. So MSF published a report in 2017 looking at how patenting behavior is across the entire vaccine development process. And many of these steps, for instance, the schedule of presentation, schedule of vaccination, for instance, now we're hearing a lot of discussion, maybe for COVID vaccines, we need 2 doses or even more. That is a schedule of vaccination. That particular method has been subject to patenting by a company, meaning that if that kind of monopoly is allowed, even some follow-on producer can come up with a different version, nobody is going to be able to use that because the method of vaccinating the patients could be under a property protection. And for diagnostic, I will not go to the details, but our past experiences also shows big companies often resort to a log-in effect, meaning that one company developed one set of technology, including the machine, the software, assay, and the maintenance and services. Nobody can switch between systems. That causes a huge inefficiency of the development. We don't really, we haven't done, full analysis on COVID diagnostics. But the mainstream business model of diagnostic industry could potentially cause an uncertainty for the future access. So if we having those concrete observations in mind, how to overcome the barriers? So in the context of COVID, we're really looking at 4 types of barriers. One is a structural barrier. So not only one product, one barrier. We're looking at the system that has been used by the industry to the extent that no matter how much public funding are put into the system, to the R&D process, at the end of the day, it's still one company decide who get what and when at what price globally. And it's enabled the company to control the technology and market that we still see the sharp inequality in industry development capacity, especially in global south. And then there's normative barriers when we talk about the voluntary actions as an inherent limitation, because the voluntary measures are entirely relying on companies' willingness to see how much they want to give, to whom, and for how long. And there's also a limitations with some of the existing provisions I will see very quickly later. When it comes to the existing safeguards, many countries have TRIPS flexibility provision in their national law, such as commercial license. However, we also see constant pressure from countries such as the US and the trading partners such as EU, constantly put pressure and say, you shouldn't be using that. So when it comes to practicality, we also see we are not only talking about patent, we're talking about a full range of intellectual assets and data and material. So to continue with some of the limitations, if you want to have this panel discussing how we can have an enabling future, The limitation of voluntary license, as said, is entirely rely on companies' willingness. Even for medicines patent post license, if company does not want to negotiate, there won't be an MP license within the current model. And the terms and conditions could potentially limit the competition and hinder research and development. We also recently published a report outlining limitation, restricting, so some of the limitation, limiting terms, including restrictive terms on the geographic scopes, and then limitation on where can company buy raw material and how to supply. And then there's also could be terms, for instance, some countries are covered as a manufacturer only, but product made by those companies cannot supply their domestic market. We have some concrete example in our report and welcome you to have a look. So if we look at the COVID context, whether any like concrete different voluntary initiative has resulted in some promising outputs, we think it's very limited, and we haven't seen very promising results so far. Even WHO started the CTAP initiative, Technology Access Partnership Initiative. The International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association openly rejected this initiative, meaning that this voluntary mechanism is not really welcomed by the industry. And so previous speaker mentioned AbbVie, company AbbVie made a non-asserted announcement saying that it will not enforce its patent globally. However, another side of the story is that this only came after Israel issued a commercial license on that particular product, and AbbVie immediately said, I'm not going to enforce that patent. For colleagues who are familiar with HIV/AIDS movement, we also know AbbVie for the past 20 years have adopted a very restricted IP approach to lopinavir, ritonavir. Some of its voluntary license terms are so restrictive, differentiating patients groups, differentiating who can get pediatric formulation and who can get adult formulation, and actually their practices have caused an ongoing shortage of supply of lopinavir in many countries we work. The vaccine company Moderna also announced a non-asserted announcement. However, it came after the company lost a patent dispute, and it did not also disclose very critical information needed for the COVID situation. And there are also limitations with existing mechanism. So existing commercial license mechanism ask a government to use the law on the case by case and product by product approach. But in the context of COVID, we need something more global and automatic and expanded. The limitation of the commercial license for exportation, for instance, are having a troublesome procedure and has only been used for once. So Brooke mentioned there is a more radical approach, which we think actually should be the unique opportunity for government to consider supporting. South Africa, India, Kenya, and Eswatini made a proposal to WTO TRIPS Council in October, proposing a waiver that is applicable for all countries. When they need, they can choose to use or they can leave it, and then they can decide not to enforce and implement IP as needed for COVID prevention treatment until the majority of the world population receive vaccine or develop immunity. The negotiation is still going on, and we see some countries oppose this process, but the proposal have got a wide support from developing countries. We consider this waiver proposal addressing the limitations of the current system very directly, and then provide a very critical legal option for country to use. When countries don't have ideal national law, for now, they can choose to use a waiver. And then it's also putting government back to the driving seat to take the responsibility and issue access. So I will stop here and then looking forward for the further discussion. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Yuan. In order to sort of keep the momentum going, because we are beginning to sort of run a little bit tight on time and wanting to leave time for questions and answers. So reminder to all the attendees, please use the question and answer box to start to stimulate for the later discussion. I would maybe perhaps ask Greg Perry and Dr. Jadov to try to keep their comments going forward just a little bit on the briefer side so we can leave enough time for some questions. So, Greg, you heard, kind of, your organization was singled out by Yuan, and so now it's your turn to maybe basically state the case from the perspective of IFPMA.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ronald. Just a bit of an introduction from myself. Yeah, I'm the Assistant Director General at the IFPMA. I've been here 2.5 years. Before that, I had the honor to be the Executive Director of the Medicines Patent Pool. And previously to that, I was 13 years in Brussels as the head of the European Generic Medicines Association. So like many of us around the table here, I have professionally dedicated my time to increasing access and looking at various models to do that. Now, I want to first thank the opportunity to put forward the industry's point of view here. And I think what I'd like to do right up front, because there's a discussion about the model really, is indicate that the medical innovation R&D model that is run by the global pharmaceutical industries and its various companies, which is based on the one hand and principally around a competitive model, but also R&D in partnership, has altered significantly the healthcare landscape. We have seen unprecedented innovation in medical science and in treatments and in vaccines. HIV is one, we can discuss that more. Hepatitis C is another. Cancer is another, just to demonstrate 3 areas. And those advances in innovation have come around as a result of a model that is practiced by the private sector. That's one based on strong medical science, patient need, which I want to emphasize, high standards of quality, safety, and efficacy of products and regulatory systems, which I also want to address, so supply chain resilience, and importantly, intellectual property. Intellectual property is a driving force for any innovative industry, any business, any organization that is working in an innovative sphere. It's especially important for one which is high risk and requires high investment. But as I said, it's equally important if you're an academic, if you're a researcher, if you're a startup, and indeed from everyone in the life science industry. What's interesting also, and I want to come back to that, we have seen not only in the last 2 generations this significant medical innovation, we've also seen the introduction of a lot of generics. And I'm very happy to have been part of bringing generic medicines to Europe, improving the regulatory structure around that to ensure market access. But the generics are based on innovations and on innovations that were based on intellectual property beforehand. So there is a life cycle, and I think it's important to emphasize that because everyone benefits from it in the end. Now, having said all that, clearly, and this industry has made it clear that innovation is fruitless, and fertile if there's no access. In fact, running in parallel with PMAC is the Asian Regulatory Conference, which I'm involved in. I'm doing some moderating and chairing. And we started off with in our first session was groundbreaking advances, and I'm just reading it, are only meaningful when they reach patients. And that's coming from the industry. So what we need to do, what we can do, and what we do is we want to find solutions that ensure that the medical innovations become accessible. So we have what we think is a model on the one hand, which is generating the innovation, And on the other hand, we've got to create a structure in which we ensure that those innovations become accessible. Now, these relate in many areas. Regulatory approval is one, supply chain efficiency, procurement, secure distribution, prioritizing primary health, universal healthcare coverage. Now, our industry has an obligation, the whole of the life science industry has an obligation, the private sector has an obligation, but I think it's more than that. There's a wider stakeholder obligations too. There's a sort of a social contract that we all need to bind to. And that includes a social contract including from governments, which includes mobilizing domestic resources, improving governments, developed countries supporting least developed countries, which we've seen, and of course the role of communities and civil societies doing the job they should be doing, which is holding others accountable. Now let me come back a little bit to the approaches of IP, and I think it's important again to stress that this has enabled a lot of collaboration and partnerships amongst the various groups. It's also enabled the fact that that we have had a very quick start in response to COVID-19. I do challenge the fact that that the response is slow. No, it's quick, and it's been quick by the life science industry. It's been quick by the private sector, and it's been quick by regulators. There's an amazing partnership that we've seen develop in doing that. And part of that has been based on existing products, which were based on IP, and being able to bring those into the system. I think significantly what IP does as well is it creates a foundation of a sustainable, resilient, and flexible industry. So you not only can take risk, and you can sink failure, because that's part of what medical scientific research is about. But it also does, and it happens, it also results in companies being able to engage in the development and neglected diseases, invest in access programs, invest in what's called non-commercial products, and also to be a very important part of the supply chain and healthcare systems. I've spoken already about the IP is also a foundation for generics, which is of course a key in many countries, and form the general part of the WHO's essential medicines list. I think one other part of patented concept of products, which is probably not talked about too much, is the intercompetition that takes place between products which are under patent. So you will have a number of treatments. Some people are saying this is wasteful. It's not. There are competitive functions going on, products which are being developed by different companies. This creates even price competition during a patent period, but it also develops competition around treatment priorities, ability to address different needs for different patients. So I think that's something that's very important. Now, when we look at the intellectual property and we look at those various models, no surprise, the industry and me personally would not be of the radical nature, if I could put it there, but of the so-called more moderate nature, but moderate and effective. That's what I think is important. So we've seen that the cooperation that is existing with many companies in the HIV area, particularly with the Medicines Patent Pool. I think Marie-Paule has mentioned that very well. I think one thing that's important in that too is what the Medicines Patent Pool has been able to do around fixed dose combinations and around pediatrics. And what is very encouraging is to see that companies that are involved in this area very much welcome the idea of patent pooling, so as to increase innovation through fixed dose combinations. And the industry and the IFPMA has actually supported the expansion of the Medicines Patent Pool, even from the beginning, from its movement from HIV to TB to hepatitis C to essential medicines, and now to COVID for developing countries. And IFPMA also and its companies partner with WIPO Research, for example, which is not very much talked about, but is a great platform for sharing. There is sharing of IP, of compounds, of facilities, of know-how to help the development of neglected diseases, TB, and malaria. Now, at this point, I could have brought it up in the discussion. It was mentioned that IFPMA rejected the CTAP. It's not a rejection because it's voluntary or anything like that. It's just from the point of the IFPMA, it's a lot of confusion was created by CTAP. We have the medicines patent pool already in place. And it's with the medicines patent pool that the industry has created a trust basis that can work from. There's also another organization, which is, if I remember the term correctly, it's the TAP, not the CTAP, but the TAP, which is an organization also set up by the WHO and UNCTAD. And that is about transfer of technologies for COVID in areas of diagnostics and, for example, PPE and delivery systems. And it's a shame that the whole discussion around CTAP has sort of lost TAP, which actually is there to do a lot of the work that's to be done. So we have COVAX, we have the ACT access, we have the medicines patent pool, we have the TAP, we have some other initiatives by WIPO, and the feeling is, well, why more? We could work with what we have. Let's focus with what we've got and move that along. Now, I want to come to two other points before I wind up, and that's coming back to the whole issue of price and access. And I think the industry has shown that it does licensing, it does tech transfer, it does patent waivers, it does non-enforcement. We've seen some of this in COVID, we've seen it in other areas. It also does differential pricing. Some people might not like it, others do, but differential pricing is ensuring that we can create access in developing countries. And that, for example, is one of the areas which was in HIV that was also pursued by a number of companies. But the point is that despite differential pricing, despite the large amount of generic products that are available, established, provided by multiple suppliers, treatments are still not accessible to millions and millions of people in the world. And why? We have an example of hypertension products. Hypertension products, right, are made by multiple number of generic manufacturers. They're all off patent, and they're very cheap, but they're still not accessible to so many people on the planet. We have this over and over again in other areas. We've had it in cancer areas as well. There are, largest number of needed products are on the EML, still not accessible. Because the problem is, it's not just about the price. When we look at the affordability equation, you can look at it from a supply and demand side. Price is very much like a supply issue, but the demand side is the ability to pay. And this is why it's so important that we focus around issues such as universal healthcare coverage, the ability for people to have access to the funding of their health through coverage. This is what is fundamentally creating a massive absence of access, is that even if the products are dirt cheap, people cannot access them because they cannot afford them in many countries. And that's why when I was talking about the social contract, we need to look at issues like government commitment. Now, there is the well-known Abuja Declaration. It's 2001 now, 15% of all annual budgets of African Union countries are supposed to be for health. I think only one or two have actually achieved that. Recently, at the UN SDG launch, which I participated in last, it's 2019 in May, there was a clear call by everybody, including civil society, for all nations to guarantee 5% of their GDP for health funding. And again, a lot of countries fall short of that. Finally, there's much talk about regulatory issues before, and I want to just say one thing here because it was said, I just the regulatory system is not reckless. The regulators are not reckless. The people who are in the regulatory profession are not reckless. I actually belong to a regulatory professional network, and we subscribe to the highest ethics standards of education, training, trust, etc. We have very robust regulatory systems in many countries. What we need to do is fundamentally help the building up of those capacities in other parts of the world. And in fact, if we look, and I make a plea here, that if we look at the regulatory issues, they are fundamentally the biggest barriers to access that we have. We have situations where we have approved products which have been delayed by 6 to 7 years in certain countries, but being available in others. Now, this is because of capacity, lack of capacity. I don't want to go into all the details, but again, at this very moment in time, PMAC is overlapping with this Asian regulatory conference, which I'm part of. And here, a big issue is around regulatory reliance. What can be done?
Greg.
So, yeah, I've got to
Yeah,
wind
sorry
up.
to. Okay, yeah, I think you really better wind up, please.
Okay, so I'll wind up there. So regulatory reliance is really important. Now, the industry made a whole series of commitments in March. I can be happy to go through with those during our panel discussion, where I can show again where the existing model and it's not exactly business as usual, but the existing model and the structure that we're using is providing very fundamental results for patients. Yeah. I'll stop there, but I have a lot more to say. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Greg. That's you can sort of see for all the attendees that if we had another kind of hour or two beyond our allocated time, there would be a lot of discussion on a lot of these different points. And I could even sort of then begin to say, well, Greg, you've just raised the whole issue of the global political economy of poverty and inequality as the backdrop in which we want to understand all of these issues of access to medicines and patents. But we'll leave that for now. Instead, I'm going to pass it right over to Dr. Jadhav and to speak a little bit from the perspective that he has, which I believe is partly about pharmaceutical manufacturing in the developing country and his role with the Serum Institute of India. So, Dr. Jadhav.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I must thank PMAC and Mary Paul Kinney. Because of her, I'm here on this panel. I think my presentation is going to be maybe partly repetitive of what has already been said, and I will try to go through it very quickly. In the section 1, what I have done is what are the existing innovative pools or network initiatives for equitable access to IP and technology are available for the manufacturers, particularly from the developing world. So some of these 10 plus universities have already come and made a resolve which involves rapidly executable non-exclusive royalty-free licenses for the intellectual property right that they have right to license for the purpose of distributing products related to COVID-19 during the pandemic and for a short period thereafter. So this is already existing, but in return assurance, what they want is the commitment to distribute the resulting product widely as possible and at low cost that allows broad accessibility in terms of the licensee. The second avenue, which is also available, which was initiated by the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and the MasterCard to tackle the pandemic, at least 15 large companies have agreed to share proprietary information. That is sharing proprietary information on drugs and vaccine to tackle this pandemic. The third one is accelerating COVID-19 therapeutic interventions and vaccine that is active. The National Institute of Health has created a partnership with US FDA and the European Medicines Agency. 16 leading pharmaceutical companies have joined them, but it does not specifically discuss intellectual property rights, but essentially, amongst other cooperative efforts, a centralized process and responses to the harmonizing and sharing methods and evaluating models. There are another tool which is open, that is Pool for Open Innovation Against Neglected Tropical Diseases, which was initiated by GSK and which is referred as BioVentures for the Global Health BVHS Pool. Mary Paul has already talked in detail on this, which is initiated by United. I will not go into the details of this. In addition to this, in mid-May 2020, WHO has embraced a proposal to create a voluntary pool to collect the patent rights, the regulatory test data, and also the information that could be shared for developing the COVID-19 vaccines and diagnostic for COVID-19. However, the comments from at least some pharma industry players shown some resistance to the idea of COVID-19 patent pool. In the section 2, I would like to say what we as a manufacturer from the developing world would like to have. That is the realistic innovative propositions, suggestions for ensuring implementation of international IPR framework, policy for rapid health response to COVID-19 public health crisis. So patent pooling would be feasible, realistic, and beneficial in the following scenario. The scenario number 1 is if it is pertaining to an IP barrier related to the aspect of utilize for any type of COVID-19 vaccine, irrespective of type of platform technology. For instance, green fluorescent protein infringement suit filed by LL Biotechnology against Pfizer, alleging that the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine uses the said green fluorescent protein for which they have not taken any license from LL. Same could be applicable to formulations, stabilizers, for developing or increasing the thermal stability, adjuvants, delivery devices, etc. If such common supplementary and allied technologies are identified across the globe, the same can be made available in the patents pool. In scenario 2, if an innovation necessitates the multiple complementary inventions owned by different parties, it will be even more difficult and time consuming and very expensive to negotiate with possibly with the patent owners for separate licenses. These pools are tied with simplified, if they are tied with simplified terms that are considered very reasonable and non-discriminatory, that will be welcome. Patent pooling would be feasible and realistic and bearable in the following scenarios. The pool should be for technology, know-how, in addition to the patents. Since even if the technology developers don't file patents, some of the know-how transfer would be charged by the developer, and unless actual technology and process is shared, manufacturers will not have efficacious vaccine and will still remain, or making the vaccine will remain the uphill task. Delaying the IP and patent enforcement. A recent initiative of scientists and lawyers have launched the COVID pledge, calling IP owners to assert relevant IP during the crisis until 1 year after the pandemic has been declared over. Later also, a voluntary amicable low-cost license fee arrangement will be sought by both parties. This will also ensure that the patents covering vaccine will not have to face validity challenges, acquisitions, and compulsory licensing decisions. Perhaps the only workable blanket pledge could be a fixed specific free license to COVID-19 vaccine without time limitations. Another will be to create a global single special patent code for the dispute purposes, which can be mediated by WIPO, that will be responsible for hearing all patent infringement matters pertaining to the different types of emergency vaccines or COVID-19 vaccines. The board of such uh, shall comprise of panel of 4 judges from USA, Europe, India, and African patents court and patents offices. Uh, if the infringements are found, damages would be nominal, and they can be charged by charging some basic licensing fees. Framework for resolving IP conflicts, that is the collaboration and the cross licensing in future. For the future and the pending patents, infringement suits can be addressed amicably upfront, so that the patent holder agrees not to file any infringement, provided prospective infringing party gives a royalty to the licensee to non-COVID potential next generation product technology of patent holders uh, interest for the licensing. And secondly, the prospective infringement party can be dealt in a suitable collaboration for non-COVID potential generation of the second generation product technology of the patent of his interest. How do we compensate the technology developer holders for their COVID related patent technology and pooling of the information, IP non-enforcement and other good gestures? WIPO can issue recommendation to all the 152 countries who are the members that come under WIPO umbrella to agree to the patent related non-COVID potential next generation vaccine products of their choice, that too without a waiver of global filing, examination and maintenance fees. What individual country level or the governments can do? Governments of the respective countries can offer indemnity against infringement proceeding. For instance, recent notice of declaration published by the Department of Health and Human Services under the Public Relation and the Emergency Preparedness Act, conferring immunity from the litigation for those engaging in acts related to COVID-19 countermeasures, also grants indemnity against the patent infringement liability for the third parties that use health technologies in their research for the COVID-19. Though this interpretation has not been tested out in the court of any country, uh, it suggests that the countries can adopt specific legislation suspending the enforcement of IP rights. And voluntary licensing still remains a win-win situation. The voluntary licenses are a mechanism for the patent holder to voluntarily allow other parties to exploit their patents, and which have been applied to several discoveries in biotechnology and genetics, and lately to the patented products repurposed for the COVID-19. For instance, for efficacious COVID-19 vaccine, provide for the various mRNA or VL should be preferred for viral vectors or adeno and measles vaccine, that is live attenuated backbone and inactivated platforms. Voluntary licensing still remains a win-win situation. We suggest, especially for the COVID-19 pandemic theory, that preferred approach would be WHO, WTO foremost for voluntary licensing of aforementioned technology of patent technology know-how owners to the interested parties, manufacturers. Secondly, if the patent and technology or the know-how of the owners disagree or deny such voluntary licensing, then the emergency provisions in all countries to immediately grant the compulsory licensing for such products. As the agency within the United Nations systems responsible for IP services, policy, information, and cooperation, WIPO is in the best way equipped to address such issues arising out for the IP innovation. And their expertise and experience in the policy, economic, and the legal aspects for implementing the IP dating from their foundation in the 19th century should be utilized. I think this is my last slide, but I would like to mention a couple of things here. Mary Paul did not mention it, but it was, I think, 2008 and 9 when she brought all the developing manufacturers together to make an effort to make pandemic vaccine. And that pandemic vaccine at that time was H5N1. So WHO came with small amount of money, with technology, and they identified initially about 6 manufacturers, and they gave this technology to them to develop the product so that in case a pandemic strikes, the developing world will also be ready with the product. Unfortunately, for I think H5N1, which did not happen, but we had to face a similar situation in 2009 with the Mexican flu, that was H1N1. And that particular help and that expertise which was transmitted or which was distributed by WHO came to help, and almost about 4 to 5 manufacturers made H1N1 vaccine. It was licensed, it was WHO pre-qualified, and it was available. Unfortunately, I think this time what we have seen with the COVID-19, nobody was prepared. But another very peculiar thing has happened with COVID-19. Because of the grand challenges for the last 20 years, the money which was given by the Gates Foundation, hundreds of laboratories have developed different technologies, different platforms, different adjuvants, different delivery systems, but they could not be used for the existing product because if you are to use them, you have to conduct a new clinical trial. And no companies, whether it is from developing world or from the developed world, were ready to invest that kind of money in a clinical trial for which the product was already developed. So we have ended up in a situation today that there are almost more than 180 candidates which are being developed by different laboratories, developing COVID-19 vaccine with different technologies. And we really don't know how these technologies are going to be pulled together, because if they have to use different adjuvants, different scale-up systems, different platforms, then the use of this IP technology, know-how, and intellectual property, uh, unless it is pulled together and available for all the manufacturers, somebody will always get into a situation in which the Pfizer has got themselves. And I think we are talking about equitable distribution. So even if the vaccine is ready, as you rightly said, that today there is no vaccine which is licensed, but all big countries who have money, they have already contracted more than 4 billion doses for themselves. So that clearly indicates that the poor countries, the middle income or low middle income countries, will definitely not have access, except for the fact that the Gavi is existing. Gavi has already said that those people who become part of the COVAX, they will get a preference if they become member of that. And the manufacturers have already contracted with Gavi to give them supply of their vaccine. In fact, from our experience, I can say that with the 2 companies, we have made contract for making their product using their technology here. The contract is very clear that 50% of the material will be supplied to Gavi at a fixed price and 50% will be kept for India, because we have almost about 1/6 of the world's population, and we will require sheer number of doses to protect our own population. So I think some sort of a agreement between the government is absolutely necessary to ensure that whatever products are being developed and will be available very shortly, they are distributed equitably. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Suresh. This has been a kind of a very information intensive, and I could see across the different panelists all kinds of points of disagreement as well as agreement. And up until your last intervention, Suresh, in terms of all the possibilities that exist, I was feeling optimistic. And then you basically reminded us that it's still, like the expression, a dog's breakfast, right? It's still a bit of a mess. Well, as we sort of try to kind of smooth out or understand a little bit how to get out of this particular mess, I want to remind people that there is the question and answer function, and we have two questions, and I'm going to begin to pose them now to the panelists. So the first is from Roger Kemp. Roger, if you can unmute yourself, and if you would like to pose that question directly to the panelists.
Good afternoon. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask this question in person. And thank you also for these excellent presentations. Actually, I was more from a practical point of view. I was interested in hearing from the different speakers what actually are these sort of generic manufacturing capacities if they are not carried out in sort of in a licensing context, as was sort of developed by Mr. Yajav. So there is, of course, a licensing manufacturing sort of which takes place. But if we were for a second to assume that there was a compulsory license issued, how much potential is there for generic sort of COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing on a sort of standalone basis? And if so, what is actually the expected impact in terms of prices for those vaccines? Because I mean, there are a couple of examples out there where I think companies have said that they would provide the sort of vaccines at no profit sort of to the patients. So what is actually the interest of generic manufacturers to engage in this? That I think would be interesting for me to understand actually the background when we talk about compulsory licensing and what generic manufacturers can do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roger. And I think to make it easy in terms of panel responses, let's go quickly in the order in which the panelists were actually presenting. So we can start with Brooke, if you would like to respond to that question briefly.
Okay, yeah, and I will try to be brief. The big issue is, we talk about compulsory licensing, and yet at this point in time, there's not much experience with compulsory licensing for trade secrets. And for vaccines in particular, we need not just patent rights, but we need basically the opportunity for what would result in deep technology transfer, includes manufacturing know-how, biologic materials, process methods, et cetera. And so, if we had a compulsory licensing system in the countries, which countries will need to do if they want to actually have compulsory licensing mean anything, then generics would be in a somewhat better place. And the advantage of the deep technology transfer, as opposed to a company trying to reverse engineer, is also in the regulatory issues as well that Greg was talking about. The issue of developing a so-called similar product versus a bio-identical product in the vaccine area, for example, would result in quite different regulatory approaches and cost of clinical trials and so forth. On price, we know that the Serum Institute has given us great hope for low price vaccines with some of the prices that it's talked about. But then we have Moderna, which has talked about a $72 vaccine. So, I think it's kind of rudely said, we're interested in selling to rich countries only. That's where we currently have capacity. And that's where we intend to make money. So we don't know how low the prices will go, and it'll probably depend on manufacturing scale and to the extent to which the best methods are transferred with technology transfer.
Thank you, Brooke. Over to you, Modipo. Anything to add?
Well, no, I agree with Brooke. It takes time to set up a production of vaccine. There's a lot of knowledge of different technologies, and I think doing it completely on one's own, at least for typical vaccine manufacturing processes. I would say maybe for RNA it's a bit different because it's a chemical in a sense, and indeed the big production of a vaccine of Moderna is not made by a vaccine manufacturer. It's made by Lonza in Switzerland. So this is a technology that might be adopted by more than what we have as vaccine manufacturers right now. But for the time being, as long as we don't know whether this works, frankly, I doubt that we would have any attempt to circumvent such IP. It's not easy to get new technologies, and I really applaud Suresh if SII is capable not only to pursue their own homegrown products for R&D, but also to adopt at the same time technology to make very different types of COVID vaccines. Not every manufacturer can do that.
Well, Suresh will get the last word around that one. But first, Greg, do you have anything to add to this from your industry perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I just do want to emphasize the commitment to fair and equitable distribution, and that's why we think that COVAX is so essential. And we do believe that there are commitments being made to ensure that there are very strong availabilities in amounts for developing countries. And it was mentioned Gavi. There's also, I think, there are funding that should be available from developed countries. But on the specific issue, I can't say much about the generic capacity. But what is clear is it is a specialized industry. Vaccines, as we've just heard, it's not small molecule production. So not everyone is going to be able to do it. We have to rely on high standard quality vaccine producers. And as you've seen, the industry is already licensing, having agreements with, for example, the Serum Institute. And I think that is the way to go. And there is, in other areas too, the industry is looking at how do we ensure there is enough production, whether it's a treatment or a vaccine. The key thing with vaccines is whatever's going to happen, we're going to have to go in steps. It's going to be priority towards healthcare workers, the elderly, the vulnerable first, and then probably a second wave. It's very unlikely at the moment we're going to be able to produce a vaccine which is going to be able to be used for the whole population, if that is required. A lot of questions still out. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And Yuan, if you.
Yeah, maybe just quickly, when I think it's probably helpful to think about what we mean by independent generic vaccine production and now and future. One thing is that, yes, there's a lot of licensing going on between companies, but apart from one very recently published by Fiocruz in Brazil, none of the other licenses are transparent. So we don't know what's going on in terms of, okay, so we see technology transfer, what kind of transfer has been done, whether it is what Brooke mentioned, the deep technology transfer, the total transfer of technology, or is only part of the technology in the whole production line. Nobody knows about that. And another thing is, as we mentioned, the voluntary licensing has an inherent problem with the geographic limitations. So far, we haven't seen, both in COVID and previously, even under MPP's effort, there's no globally covered voluntary license. So whether or not that model actually fit the purpose for the global pandemic, when population could be excluded based on commercial gain, we don't know. So in terms of independent manufacturer, I think it's also important to look at the future. If we look at the current manufacturing capacity gap, it's very obvious. Many parts of the world has not benefited at all in the past decades when the global IP system is booming and then technology transfer is so few. So we have a concentrated production capacity on vaccine in certain countries, but many of the global South countries don't have that kind of capacity. To what extent a new approach of total openness could potentially be more efficient? Then rely on restrictive licensing that's totally secret and nobody knows what has been signed.
So thank you. In terms of Suresh's huge list of all the possibilities that exist and other possibilities that panelists have recommended, Yuan, you're kind of making a case for we need something that is more fundamentally, structurally, systemically different. You've also raised an interesting issue that has yet to really come up, is that why has there been so much opacity, such a lack of transparency in all of the different negotiations, deals, or measures that are taking place between governments, even between COVAX, between pharmaceuticals? I mean, we just don't really know. But I'll hold off on that now, because I'd like to turn to Suresh about the original question and add just one more that came in from an anonymous attendee, because it was really specifically addressing a point that you raised. And if you could comment on that as well. It was saying when you talk about voluntary licensing as a win-win situation, do you think it will be so only when there is no geographic limitations on where the generics can supply? So Suresh.
Thank you very much. I think just to give a brief background, at the moment, Serum Institute for last about 3 years have been making almost about 1.5 billion doses per year and supplying them. Our track record is that we have got almost more than 25 products which are WHO pre-qualified and which we supply to UNICEF, PAHO, and other middle income and low income countries. Having said so, we already had in our pipeline at least about 5-6 different products for which we were making infrastructure. But these products will take at least another about 1.5 to 2 years to come to a stage of licensing. Fortunately, because the infrastructure was ready, we could come out, and my CEO has gone on record and said that he will make at least about 1 billion doses per year. So we have already, I think, reached a capacity of almost about 60 to 70 million doses per month. And from January onwards, we will be making almost about 100 million doses per month of COVID vaccine, which will be either AstraZeneca or Novavax or our own RBD vaccine, which is also getting into the phase 3 now. Having said so, I think it's on the public record that we have made a contract with Gavi to supply the product at about $3 a dose. So that means for $6, you will get 2 doses as against $75, $76 of Moderna. I don't want to make any comparison, but I am quite sure, and as I think it is already mentioned, that price of the vaccine depends upon the capacities. If you have higher capacities and if you utilize your capacity to full extent, the cost goes down. If it's not like a small biomolecule where you make small quantities where the cost becomes very high. But if you are using fermenters, and if you instead of using 200-liter fermenter, you go to 3,000 liter or 4,000 or 5,000 liter fermenter, the cost of production goes down substantially down. And then you are in a position to supply the product at a very affordable price. Just to make a mention, I think Mary Paul will bear me out on that. When Sub-Saharan Africa needed meningococcal vaccine, meningitis against meningitis A, Big Pharma said that yes, they had a product. It was for one company almost in phase 3, but they stopped it because the buyer was African nation, the poor African nations. And they said that they cannot afford the product if it is going to cost them more than 50 cents a dose. So they wanted a product which will cost them 50 cents a dose or less. And then when they came to Serum Institute, we did our calculation, we saw the technology, and we agreed to supply them at 40 cents a dose. And this contract was signed in 2004, and we supplied the product in 2010 at a price less than 50 cents. So we kept our promise of the price which was calculated actually in 2003 and 4. And I must say, the mandate to me at that time from my chairman was, go ahead, but I don't want to make losses on this product. Even if we don't make any profit, it's all right, but I don't want to make losses. And let me tell you that we did not make losses on that product. And today the situation is that whole of Sub-Saharan Africa, the meningitis belt, in the vaccinated population, that there is not a single case of meningitis A in that belt.
Thank you very much, Suresh. You're making a strong case, almost a kind of a promotional pitch for the Serum Institute of India, but that's okay. We have another question, and I want to sort of preface that question by posing one of my own to the panel, which would probably take us to the end of this particular section. My question is that I would pose is that it's related, is that why shouldn't the temporary TRIPS COVID waiver not be supported? Why should we not? Why should not we support this? And that's to high-income countries and to pharma. It sort of seems to be at least a step that would enable greater cooperation. Brooke, you mentioned Article 73 and the kind of security provision exception. Would that not have to initially go through dispute panel before it and potentially be challenged at a dispute panel before it could actually be undertaken, hence the TRIPS waiver? But then finally, the question from an anonymous attendee, what could they comment on the legal challenges and available solutions to facilitate sharing of know-how to improve technology transfer, manufacturing capacity for vaccines, as well as for diagnostics? So maybe take that last question first, then we can go back to the TRIPS questions that I've put to you, the TRIPS waiver question. I'm going to mix up the order a bit first. So maybe Marie Paulkini, if you want to go first on that set of questions.
On which one? Can you repeat it? Which one you want me to take over?
Well, start with the one about the potential legal challenges or available solutions to facilitate sharing of know-how to improve technology transfer, etc. If you feel comfortable answering that, if not, you could go on the TRIPS waiver.
I would, yeah, on the TRIPS, and why is it not so embraced? Because I think that the manufacturers see the originators and even the others who have patents also see the IP that they have filed for and for which they have received actually rights as one of their main assets. And so when you see something as your treasure, it's difficult to say that you give it and you have no control. So one of the things is about the complete absence of control if it's put in a pot. Okay, I would say so. This is one, and the second one is that there is always an anxiety that this might be a first step towards negating IP rights.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there.
And certainly this is not what they want to do.
Okay, Yuan, very quickly, do you have a response to that? But very quick, because we've only got a few minutes left.
On the TRIPS waiver? Yeah.
Sure, either TRIPS waiver or any potential legal challenges and how to overcome them.
Yeah, I think maybe combine these two. I think one of the challenges, as Brooke mentioned, for instance, when we talk about flexibility, there's nothing called compulsory license on trade secrets. So to say, the flexibility on accessing to know-how is also limited. Technology transfer, there's no hard law obligation. And there is an Article 66.2 and the TRIPS asking government to have incentive to encourage the company to do transfer, but then it's watered down again into a very soft implementation mechanism. So, I mean, there's a gap there in the international law to say we have a guarantee the technology have to be transferred unless a government go to India patent law, local working requirement as a grant for compulsory license as a threat. But not every country have that law in place. Therefore, linking to the waiver, we think every country should support it. There's no reason why not. Because looking at the mess we are in now, there are some potential solutions. But at the end of the day, what government have in hand, if company don't want to do things, you have a very limited options. So waiver should be supported. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've only got about 1 minute left. So if I could just go very quickly in this order, and you have a last word around this whole set of issues. Suresh, Greg, and then back to Brooke.
So I think we definitely support the intellectual property rights and IP and patent and the ownership. But I think when it comes to the public good, or when it comes to a situation like what COVID has brought us to, where everybody is affected, because it does not distinguish between poor and rich, or the impoverished, or the people who have the facilities at their disposal. So I think government should support it, and we also respect the individual company's right to have some compensation for giving away those rights.
Okay, thanks very much. Greg, now unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll watch your lips move with considerable interest.
Okay, no, I think basically there are TRIPS flexibilities if the countries want to use them that already exist. And I think, to be honest, this initiative takes away from what is probably much more needed. We talk about people's vaccines. Everything is being done. It's all in the process. It's being done. We're time limited. The vaccines are in the process. I think what is needed is to look more at where we can use the licensing agreements. We've got to look at things like procurement. We've got to look at things like vaccine acceptance. This is where we need to put the efforts in now.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And Brooke, last word.
So I don't want to leave unchallenged the idea that COVAX is going to be enough. I mean, it's promised at best to supply 20% of need in low and middle income countries. It's just, what happens after that? COVAX has basically said it's there for the acute phase, and that the market will take care of things thereafter. And that's simply not borne out by history. I want to just raise the importance of the human rights perspective as well. We've talked almost exclusively about intellectual property on this panel, but there's a human rights framework as well. It's clearly established the right to medicines and the right to the benefits of science and scientific progress and its applications. I'd like to just say on the technology transfer and trade secrets, there's no direct TRIPS prohibition in the text of TRIPS against such an exception. And secondly, it's clear that the waiver or the national security measures could both be used, and that countries have freedom. Countries establish trade secret rules, and they can establish exceptions to them. And so I think that there's lots that needs to be done both at the global level, but the countries also have to step up and protect the interests of their populations.
Okay, thanks very much, Brooke. And I think that is now kind of drawing the session to a close. We've only got a couple of minutes before it formally will come to an end. So I will ask the Secretariat at this point if they want to essentially pop up our evaluation questions. Okay, so to all of the attendees, you'll sort of see that we have this pop-up now of a number of just 5 short evaluation questions, and we ask all of you to very quickly rate these if you can. And while you're reading these particular questions, I would like to draw your attention to the next upcoming webinar of the PMAC 2021, and that's on governance for health towards more equitable policymaking and ethical partnerships. And that's going to be on the 10th of November, 1800 UTC, or 7 o'clock Bangkok time. I think, once again, that's the middle of the night or early morning for me. So I'd like to thank PMAC for bringing this session together. I particularly like to thank our speakers, Professor Brooke Baker, Dr. Modi Paulkini, Dr. Yuan Cheong-Hu, Mr. Greg Perry, and Dr. Shuras Jadhav. It's an intriguing session. This is an issue that's been long-standing in global policy debates. I don't think it's going to necessarily be resolved, but COVID-19 has brought it perhaps more to a kind of a boiling point, where we can try to see if we can move beyond some of the strictures and issues that have faced around intellectual property rights and innovation as we go forward. And I'm still intrigued, of course, by the fact that extended intellectual property rights in terms of innovation really only began to grow copiously and to grow globally in the 1980s, which makes me wonder, in a way, is that whatever happened to innovation before that time? So just a provocative question on which to end. Again, like to thank everybody else and to thank PMAC for hosting this session. Over.